And we are live.
Hello and welcome to the May planning retreat for the Durham Planning Commission. The Durham Planning Commission is an advisory board to the City Council. And the County Board of Commissioners. We're an appointed body. There will be no action items on tonight's agenda. And instead, we're going to be receiving some updates and having some discussions on the comprehensive planning process, particularly with the draft policies that were just released from the planning department. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to staff for introductions, and then I believe we'll get an update on the comprehensive plan.
Good evening. I'm Scott Whiteman with the Planning Department. With us tonight, we also have Lisa Miller, Carl Kolosna, Brooke Roper, and Kayla Seibel, who are also with the Planning Department and working on the comprehensive plan. Mr. Chair, do we need to take attendance?
That'd be good.
Okay.
Yes, may we have roll call?
Sure. So we have Chair Amendolia.
Here.
Commissioner Baker.
Here.
Commissioner Batista.
Here.
Commissioner Busby.
Here.
Vice Chair Cameron.
Here.
Commissioner Cutright.
Here.
Commissioner Durkin.
Here.
Commissioner Harrod. Commissioner Lowe. See him. Commissioner McIver.
Here.
Commissioner Morgan.
Here.
Commissioner Cease.
Here.
Commissioner Carmen Williams. And Commissioner Zuri Williams.
Here.
All right. Are you ready for us to just dive in, Mr. Chair? All right, I'll start us off, and then Lisa and Carl I'll give a few updates, and then Lisa and Carl will go through the main part of the agenda, which is the discussion of the draft policies. All right, so just some updates on where we are, and particularly since the last retreat in January. I'm sure you all remember the discussions on the place type map. We're still working on the edits to the map, and we'll release a new draft later this year. We're taking the commission's comments into consideration, as well as the feedback we got from the public. We're also continuing to test drive the map with zoning submittals and pre-submittals to make sure it actually works in real life. Two of the specific suggestions from the commission we're working on folding into the draft is kind of getting rid of some of the smaller place types. I know that we described as granular, and kind of folding them into the similar place types that are around them. And then also for the planned suburban residential places that have not yet developed, to assign them a place type of what the ultimate place type should be. Because until it's developed, it could change in the future, and so provide some guidance for staff and the commission on what that change should be. We also discussed the urban growth boundary at the January retreat, as well as the future growth areas, which are areas in the urban growth boundary where growth should be phased out to a later time when critical infrastructure is in place. At the Joint City County Planning Committee meeting last month, we floated some further revisions to the urban growth boundary based on some of the feedback we received on the winter engagement, and which would reduce the urban growth boundary even further, primarily areas that would require expensive improvements to serve with public sewer, such as new lift stations. So one key area this included is the Arrowhead area in West Durham, which is currently in the rural tier, but was shown in the place type map as a future growth area. We received a lot of comments during winter engagement from residents in the area requesting it remain outside the urban growth boundary. and the water management department determined it would take very expensive improvements to be able to serve the area with city sewer. We do acknowledge, though, that there are some property owners and residents in the area that are still strongly in favor of adding that to the urban growth boundary. There's some other areas that would be removed from the urban growth boundary on Umstead Road near the River State Park, some areas along Old Oxford Road, Cheek Road, and Farrington Mill. We'll update the proposed boundary for the next draft of the place type map. And we can share a map with you all if you want to look at these in more detail. It's also the proposed urban growth boundary as presented to the JCCPC is also now available on Durham maps as a layer you can turn on for anyone who really wants to dig into detail. So if these are ultimately approved, it would reduce the urban growth boundary, what we now in our current comprehensive plan call the suburban tier boundary, by about 13 square miles, which is still a relatively small portion of the area, Durham and its future urban growth areas. But it is about the size of the town of Clayton. So that's not an insubstantial amount. So any questions on that before we start talking about the spring engagement strategy? All right. Oh, I see Commissioner Cease's hand, little yellow hand is up.
Lots of practice raising the yellow hand. So when you say, are there any questions on that? Does that mean the urban growth boundary? I think that was, that's what you're asking about.
Yeah, anything about the urban growth boundary or the place type map revisions?
Yeah, so, well, those are two big items, and I know the place types is kind of not the topic today, but the urban growth boundary was identified, I think, as one of our discussion points, right, on the agenda. And so I do have some questions about it. You mentioned the areas that are within the current suburban tier that are to both in the earlier round and in a more recent round as a response of, I guess, the outreach and engagement and the meetings are to be excluded or to be moved out of the urban growth boundary. What types of, and you referenced the conversation with regards to lift stations and such. It looks like some of those are to the north, some of those are to the south. And the reference to lift stations, I guess two questions. In most instances in which, or maybe all instances in which there's development occurring where there's not sewer in those areas, the cost burden is borne by the developer for those extensions, correct?
That's correct.
So I think that's an important item just to clarify that the input from water management is not one based on reducing city costs. It may be an important consideration for overall development costs, but it's not one based on reducing city costs.
Well, one clarification, Commissioner Cease, is as the standard planning answer, it depends a lot. If it's an area that's already served by sewer and already served by a lift station, and additional development would trigger, which is the case in Arrowhead, significant improvements to that lift station. It's often the responsibility of the city, since there's not one developer who can fix that, to front the costs, and either the ratepayers pay for that cost, or we have to come up with some complicated structure like we do in Southeast Durham.
So I get that. Yeah, it depends. And so I think, and that's what I'm trying to clarify, is that it depends. And I don't think that the issue of reducing the urban growth boundary should be hung on the nail of places where expensive sewer infrastructure would need to be invested. There's a much broader conversation, I think, there that's warranted around those areas. And maybe that conversation's been had, but I've not heard it. I've seen some of the issues, and I'm not talking about Arrowhead. That's a place where the revision was to include it. and I don't think, based on the conversations we had as a group and some of the feedback I've seen from the public, I'm not questioning that. I wholeheartedly support leaving that out of the urban growth boundary. My question is more about the areas that are within the current suburban tier that we're pulling out of the urban growth boundary, because there's a big difference in terms of things like location efficiency. You know, our region doesn't stop at the county line, and you know, the areas to the north are different than areas to the south or areas to the east towards Raleigh. Those are very different animals. And from a development perspective, there's also, you know, the sheer economics are not just, it's not just city costs, it's private cost as well. And so I guess my question is, or one question is, you know, what types of outreach or engagement have occurred with regards to specifically reaching out to those property owners, especially larger property owners, that places that could be transformed for development in areas proposed to be removed from the suburban tier?
Yeah, so we're going to need to work on some additional outreach that we're going to need to do for that. We have not done any of that yet. And I think I would suggest, Commissioner Cease, we wanted to provide an update of what we proposed, but we can be prepared to talk about this in much more detail at y'all's next retreat when we talk about the map again. Because we want to save as much time as we can to talk about the policies.
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought the agenda had about 20 minutes on this item and 45 minutes on policy. So if that's not the intention, and you introduced a very important item and said, are there any questions? So yes is the answer to your question. There are questions. I don't want to proceed with an agenda item on the record saying that this body spent 25, 30 minutes discussing an item if we weren't even allowed to really address a question in earnest. I don't think that's fair to the public engagement process either. So, but maybe we should revise the agenda. Thanks.
Scott, I had a real quick question.
Yeah.
You know, Commissioner Cease brought up an interesting point, was as we're expanding into different growth areas, have we reached out to any of the neighboring counties to see what their strategies are that might affect some of our growth as well? Have we done any kind of outreach in that regard? That's more of a yes or no question.
Yeah, we do. We have continual discussions with our neighboring counties and municipalities, particularly the ones where growth is happening. Like, for example, we don't have a lot of discussion with Person County since there's not a lot that happens up there, but
right.
We do try to coordinate when there's with the plans of our neighbors as well.
Yeah, seeing what's kind of growing on the Wake County side, you know, from what I see, and then possibly what's going on in Orange or Chatham might be of interest to see where that's going. Okay, thank you.
All right, well, if there's nothing else other than, we understand, Commissioner Cease, you do have more questions that we need to talk about later at some point. But just as an update on our spring engagement strategy for the policies, we wanted to give you a quick overview of our engagement strategy this spring to share out and get feedback from the community on the policies. Engagement on the policies officially began last Wednesday and will be going through the end of June. We are very pleased to say that the Office on Youth has agreed to partner with our team to design engagement strategies specifically to reach youth and Spanish-speaking residents, two groups of residents that we have struggled to reach in the previous phases. We are again working with Ideal Ortiz to design an engagement ambassador program to get feedback and input on the policies from residents who have historically been excluded or marginalized in previous planning efforts. We are working with engagement ambassadors to support them holding their own discussion sessions to review and give input on the policies, as well as 4 sessions that will be for any engagement ambassadors or their contacts to attend and give feedback directly on the policies. Finally, as before, we have developed and published an online engagement opportunity via our web platform, Social Pinpoint, to review the policies and give us feedback. The online survey is open to everyone. Staff will also be holding 5 sessions called Ask a Planner sessions, where anyone can drop in to ask questions or get more information about the policies with planning staff. After this engagement phase concludes at the end of June, staff will be organizing all the feedback we received and begin draft revisions to the policies. That is a very brief overview of the engagement strategy. Are there any questions about that? All right, well, with that, I will turn it over to Lisa and Carl to just lead you all in a discussion of the draft policies.
Great, thank you, Scott. So like Scott just said, we'd want to shift our discussion a little bit to thoughts on the initial draft policies. So I'll give a little bit of background information to sort of frame up this discussion. So these policies are intended to help us work towards making the vision in the adopted community goals and objectives a reality in our community. As many of you know, these drafts were co-created by staff and residents through the policy working groups over the last several months. And we really want to thank you all who participated in those groups. So as we discuss the policies together today, we'd like you to think about all the ways that the comprehensive plan policies can be used. We've been thinking about this in sort of 3 main ways. That first is to guide legislative decisions and the advisory review and vote that you all do on those cases, rezonings, for example. And the second is to sort of develop the planning department's work program each year. And then the third is to inform the work of other departments and organizations in the community. And we know from feedback from you all and others that we need to be sure that the plan has really clear policy that applies to new development to assist you all as you're doing your review of those legislative decisions. So we'll be trying to keep the discussion today focused on the draft policies, as this is our sort of primary opportunity to discuss these with you. And we know you all have thoughts and questions about the place type map and other parts of the plan, but we think it's really essential to hear thoughts on the policies now when we have the opportunity to really incorporate that input as we're making revisions to them at the end of this engagement round. So we shared a few discussion questions ahead of time, and we'd like to start off today by asking each of you to share first what policy ideas are you most excited about? And we'd like to go around and give everyone the chance to share their answer to that. And then once we've shared, please choose the next person to share that. And then we'll move on into sort of a more free-form discussion on the remaining questions, so that we ask that each of you make space for each person on the commission to participate in the discussion. So I'm not sure if there's someone that would like to go first, just sort of talking about, again, as a reminder, thinking about, we're going to start with what policy ideas are you most excited about, talk about that for a little bit, pass it off to the next person, and then we'll go into sort of a free-form discussion. There's someone that would like to start us off and then pass it along to somebody else.
I'll start.
Great.
Hi, I'm Zuri. I am most excited about the housing and the community relationships policies. I think they're really important. They help to frame the conversation, one just about housing and the growth that we're seeing, and also making space for individuals who may not have had a voice historically in the planning process. So yes, that's what I'm excited about. I will pass it to Commissioner Morgan.
Thanks, Zuri. I guess what I'm most excited about is some of the community and neighborhood focused type of policies that came up. Certainly, I think that's important to actually work with our residents and get their priorities as far as their neighborhood and actually provide some of the tactical input that we've received. I think some of the policies that we do have are more tactics in general, and that could be folded in. I'm also excited about some of the plans about annexation and some of the growth management strategies, and like to see how that kind of gets developed a little bit more. So that's kind of my interest, is what I see. Certainly areas like that, we're going to have to look at funding for improvements and areas of building infrastructure. So those are the kinds of things that probably need to be fleshed out a little bit more. But I do see we're kind of heading in that direction. One other comment that I might make is I look at the engaged goals and I look at the subject areas, and I see that there's an opportunity to try to align what our policy groups were with the goals and strategies that are on the engaged site. And I guess I'll pass that over to Mr. Cease.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's a comprehensive list, and so there's many places one could reach out to for excitement. I think the ones that are most exciting to me are the ones that speak to the various ways that diversity manifests itself for the public good and for private benefits in ways that are influenced by this commission and ways that are influenced by planning and land use decisions. And so some of those are in housing, some are in transportation, some are in education, and the ways in which engagement are addressed. And I guess maybe a way of summarizing that is, a lot of these are generic, they're generic in a spatial sense. But a lot of them are very specific in a spatial sense, and it's those that I'm excited by. So I'll pass it over to Commissioner Durkin.
I'm most excited about the affordable housing piece, and so I was on the whatever, Lisa, whatever, and Carl, whatever we called our little team, the neighborhood team for
working group.
putting all these. Yes, thank you. And it was, there are a lot of policies, and I can attest to the fact that there were a whole lot more that we have boiled down and consolidated and trying to get as an efficient list as possible, which seems like a crazy thing to say given how many policies there are. But I am excited about the housing piece and the engagement of neighbors and neighborhoods, and see what happens and putting this into practice. I will pass it along to Almandolia.
Great. So I'm a little bit biased because I was on the transportation policy working group, but I really loved the work that came out of that. In particular, I really loved the focus on accessibility and the focus on paratransit, the fact that that's being called out explicitly in these draft policies. I learned a lot about how our current transit system fails folks who need more accessible bus routes and sidewalks and everything. And it was really good to see that translated into the policies, and hopefully we'll get to see that make changes over the next several years. I also, just like a high level thing, I loved the process for these, and Commissioner Cease touched on it as well, with the diversity of folks that got to participate in this process, and hearing different perspectives from community members who need transit to transit professionals who are shaping our transit systems very directly. It was really a great experience to just get everyone together and talk about both what needs to get done and talk about a path to actually getting that done. And I will pass to Commissioner Cutright.
Thanks, Chair. To everyone's point, there are tons of policies here, but what's really interesting to me are, in an attempt to not comment on some of the others that have been said, are the health concerns or the policies related to health. It's approached in a lot of different ways, in which you can approach health in a number of ways. I think it's important to really, I think, bring to the surface the intersection of housing and healthcare and what we can do to help ensure that people, the underserved communities, are getting the things they need, however it might manifest itself, whether that's through parks, whether that's through clinics that are around. So to me, that's one of the most exciting things that I'm seeing here in the policies. Commissioner Cameron.
Thank you, Commissioner Cutright. So I guess the thing that excites me the most are the policies that relate to neighborhoods. When we talk about the infill of designing new neighborhoods or designing neighborhoods that will infill slots in other, I guess, like missing teeth of neighborhoods to make sure that they connect and they include housing and resources for the residents. Also of interest are the retrofit of existing buildings in those neighborhoods, whether they be office buildings, vacant buildings, probably old manufacturing buildings, and in particularly the aging shopping centers that we have around Durham that are just vacant and are just, not, contributing to the neighborhoods. And so being able to retrofit those buildings to create jobs and housing and resources for the neighborhood, it just encompasses everything, I think, transportation, all of that. Even though I was on the jobs committee, we talked about retrofitting as well. So I will pass it to who's not gone. Commissioner Batista.
Hi, thanks. Excuse me. Yeah, I'm very much interested in policies relating to communities, so neighborhoods, but also public transportation. Being a map geek and a professional in that community, I'm very much interested in how these things impact each other. And there's a harmony there that we're working towards. So I really like to see efforts in that direction. And just as a side note, I spent last week at a geospatial intelligence symposium, and one of the emerging trends in there was human sentiment mapping. How does the public feel about what you're doing in their area, and how do they feel about their own behaviors in those areas? So this is all the kind of stuff that makes me excited. So I'm going to keep it general. So thank you for that. So who else hasn't gone, or was I the last? So Commissioner Baker, I'll pass to you.
Yeah, when I went ahead and listed them all, listed the ones that I'm excited about. And there were a few where I added hell yes right next to them. But I think in general, I really like the policies that are very clear and understandable and provide very clear direction. There were a lot of good policies that were very general and high level, and those are good too. But I think we would really, especially this body, would really benefit from very direct and clear policies. A couple of the hell yeses here. The H01, it just says include affordable housing in new development proposals, and I just like slammed my fist on the table and thought it was awesome. So I think that was a great one. The carbon neutrality, the 30% open space, these are just like really bold but really clear, and I think really really very much possible. So yeah, I think that's it. Is there anybody else? Okay, Brian.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to actually just circle back to something that David said at the beginning. I agree with everything. It's just really outstanding work. It's really exciting to look at everything. The ones that I was particularly excited about were seeing the designating the future growth areas on the place type map and establishing the urban growth boundary, but both come with actual hooks. At least in theory, there are hooks. And so that was important. And so I'm excited about that. And then the question is, will we actually use those hooks? So I'm about to go off this commission so I can start saying things like that. So will we actually stick to this? But there's a lot of great stuff in here. And so really great work by all of you and the staff to pull this together.
Great, thank you, everyone. We just wanted to start sort of start off like that. So there were a number of other discussion questions that we mentioned. We wanted to start on a positive note, but these policies are still in draft, and we know, despite a lot of work, they're by no means perfect. And we would really like to hear ideas or suggestions about how we can make these policies better as we're getting ready to revise them once this upcoming engagement phase ends. So Kayla just dropped it in the chat, but I'll just read them out. Just thinking about what policy ideas do you think maybe need to be changed? What do you see as missing from the list of policies? And are there any policy edits or new policies that we need to be sure that we have really clear policy to apply to new development cases, which we know for you all obviously is hearing that is particularly important. So those are sort of some of the big picture questions that we had. We wanted to just kind of open it up to a more free-form discussion at this point and have folks really start to get into the weeds of, if there are specific policies, we've got the numbers and lines for them, and we're taking detailed notes if there are thoughts that you all have in this session. And of course, as we're finishing up today, we hope and expect that you all are going to continue to have input on these policies as you have more time to review them and think about them as cases are happening through May and June. So we'd really love for you all to share them and any input that you've got between now and the end of June when this engagement phase is going to close. So yeah, I'd just like to open it up. I'm not sure if there's somebody that would like to start first, but thinking about how can we make these policies better, or what improvements can we make to them? Commissioner Busby.
Great, thanks. Actually, I just have more of a question, I think, to help clarify kind of the thinking around it. I did just want to say, similar to Commissioner Baker, I mean, there's just a bunch of things in here I thought were really smart. I mean, the natural gas infrastructure, that's line 53. I really like that. I think that's a great big picture goal. I think the mass grading has been an issue that's been around for a while, so I appreciate that as well. The question was the line 196, so that's P04, and it talks about the mixed residential neighborhood place. Trying to look at it as I'm talking to you as well. But it basically talked about mixed residential neighborhoods greater than 80 developable acres should include a mix of at least 3 housing types. And then smaller than 20 developable acres should increase the housing mix in the immediate vicinity. I'm just kind of curious, what was the thinking about those numbers? It just seemed like my immediate reaction was, wow, that's a really big gap. And are there other things we can be looking at or smaller sizes? But I just wanted to get the overall sense of the thinking on the sizes, those numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll hand it over to my colleague, Scott Whiteman, for that one.
Yeah, so that's one, and it's certainly something the commission has talked about a lot, and so the council and county commissioners is that, and it's what we heard a lot of during all of our engagement, is that new development should have a mix of units, of unit types. And so we are putting this out there to provide some guidance as to sometimes some developments are going to be small enough that it's really hard to mix multiple types of units in there. And there's going to be a point where they're really big developments and it should be significantly easier based on financing and all that sorts of things to add multiple units in there. There's nothing particularly magic about these numbers. We're just trying to find some reasonable thresholds, but this is something, those numbers are something we're we're expecting to hear a lot of feedback from both from folks like you all and the development community and residents. So would be interested in hearing your feedback on too big, too small, one more, one less, those sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, my personal instinct is I'd love to see the 80 come lower, but I'd really want to hear from my colleagues, especially that have expertise in this area. I mean, Commissioners Cameron and Cutright, Cease, Baker, Durkin, I mean, all of you have your hands in this world. So I'm just interested in what was your reaction to that number?
Eighty's a lot of acres. It's a lot. That's a whole, yeah, well, yeah, that's a lot to say at least 3 types of housing. You can get 3 types of housing on a lot less acres than 80. And so I think that threshold may be too high, and we'll just see more of the same that we push back against.
Yeah, 80 acres is 2 neighborhoods. You know, I think that thinking in the increments of city blocks is in terms of acreage, kind of translating to acreage, is something that I have found myself doing, not over the course of my practice, but just as I've been on this commission. And you know, a good city block size is about 4 acres. And so, I would advocate, first of all, if you're doing 20 acres and you don't have but one housing type, you're not doing a mixed residential neighborhood. So I think there's just, I wouldn't have a threshold for a mixed residential place type to have 2 housing types, or else you don't have a mixed residential neighborhood. And that, so I think the question, your observation on that item raises the question about those thresholds, but I think it also raises the question just about the nomenclature. And that I know we've talked about in the past with some of the other place types as well. And so I to the extent that many of the items in here establish very clear goals, I think this is one where, the impact of it is diluted by attempting to put a threshold in there. If we're doing 4, if you're in a mixed residential neighborhood place type, of several acres, it should be mixed residential types, or you're not doing a mixed residential type. That's my perspective. And the 80 is huge. It's off the charts. Most and particularly in light of parcelization patterns in Durham, and the size of tracts that remain for development in places that we want to become mixed in residential character. There aren't a lot of those, so those are really not very aspirational thresholds in my view.
Yeah. I would just add to that that I've seen a site plan that would fit the mixed residential category just over 8 acres. So yeah, I agree with that. I think having a threshold there may not be necessary.
Just out of curiosity, particularly from those of you who deal with this on a more day-to-day basis, is there a reasonable size where we should expect more than 2? I get the strong feeling that 80 is way too high, but there's probably some sort of reasonable threshold. But even if you don't have the answer now, well, we'd be happy to take that input from y'all.
Yeah, I think if you follow Commissioner Cease's thought process of how much a city block is, how many acres is a city block? And in an old school city block, you could get 3 housing types in one city block, so.
Yeah,
Remove the 0.
I was going to say it might be a great aspirational goal of what you might use as a policy, but you don't have to put a number to it, where you're coaching developers to do that. Go ahead, Nate. Sorry.
Oh, no, you're good. I was just inserting real quick.
Well, and Scott, just as a follow-up, I mean, I hear you saying maybe having numbers and thresholds would be a useful thing. I'm hearing some of my fellow commissioners saying maybe not. My gut instinct was, I think it's good to have numbers and thresholds to require things, but maybe lower thresholds in terms of size and more numbers of mixed use. But I'm not an expert, but I've been on this commission for a long time, and we still see a lot of the same old coming in. And so I like the fact that you were trying to put some hooks and some numbers. I just think the numbers should come way down and the amount of mixed use should go up. It was my kind of initial reaction.
So to that point, that's a very kind of, I don't want to say typical, but it's a fairly common way of addressing just place types in general, is ensuring that there are kind of a range of percentages of whatever the mix of uses are that go into the composition of a place type. And so our discussion, is focused on these numbers in this particular line item in this particular format. But part of my hesitation and question and thinking is that in the descriptions of what these place types are, the next evolution of the guide, the next evolution of the map, clarity around the numbers is something that is going to be absolutely essential for those to have any meaning. And so I'm not sure, Commissioner Baker said 0. I'm not sure if the number belongs in this document, but that doesn't mean the clarity and guidance doesn't belong in the materials that evolve out of this process. And in allowing them to rest elsewhere in the guide, that also allows those to be fine-tuned over time, perhaps more easily than the policies. And that's kind of supposition on my part. I don't know. But it's a question of where is it best to put the precision and guidance. And so, but if Scott wants to pin us down and say, what's the number, at a minimum, drop the zeros. But I would advocate just doing away, as Commissioner Baker said, certainly with the smaller one. But if you're not doing multiple types, you're not doing a mixed residential neighborhood. So I don't think this is the place for the threshold. I think it's in the description.
All right, definitely not trying to pin you down, Commissioner Cease.
I just have a quick question here, just for some clarification. So we're looking at the general policies. There's also going to be, so let's say we're reviewing a zoning case. So we'll look at the general policies, which is kind of like these ones, and then also the policies that are specific to the place type where that is. But it also looks like we do have some place type policies included here with the general policies. Is there a reason why we're seeing that? So that's one question. And then I just want to clarify the difference between like policies and actions, like policies guiding decision-making, actions, something that the staff is going to go and proactively do. And we're looking just at the policies and not the actions, right? And I just want to clarify that because there are, a couple actions, not a big deal. And then I was just gonna mention that it would be, I could see some usefulness in consolidating well, never mind. Actually, that's more. Yeah, never mind. Those are my two questions.
Yeah. So Commissioner Baker, I'll answer the last question because it's easy. So yes, these are just policies. There may be some things that are skirting on the edge of being actions. We decided to, when in doubt, call it a policy. But that's certainly something we can address later when the full draft is done. And then kind of the approach we took for the place type guide, we didn't want to put any really, I can't think of a better term than juicy at the moment, but really juicy details in there because we were afraid the place type guide would not get the same level of kind of scrutiny and engagement that the policies would. So we wanted things that we really wanted to make sure the public gave us feedback on in the policies, and we can decide later on. And Commissioner C's made some really good points, is that maybe the place type specific policies, once we're done with this phase, might be better placed in the guide. But we just want to make sure that people see them and give us feedback, so they can't, we don't want it to look like we just tried to hide it in the guide, which was not as accessible. So I hope that makes sense.
That makes sense. Thanks.
I guess just one follow-up on that, Scott, is I appreciate you sharing that thinking. That may work out to be the best, but I was actually thinking the reverse, and kind of throughout this process, I was thinking the reverse. And maybe that's just because the world I work in is more often much more, much more closely associated with the physical policies, design decisions, planning decisions, land use decisions, infrastructure decisions, et cetera. But thinking as a citizen consumer, and especially now that we have this draft list of policies, there's a lot here, right, to digest. A lot of it is general. Some of it is very specific spatially. A lot of it's aspirational, appropriately so. But from the standpoint of how this body engages with the public in public hearings around particular cases, it would seem, or my way of thinking about the place types guide is and Commissioner Amendolia has done this, as he's referred back to that in each of the cases that's come before us. And if the place types guide is a couple of pages that describes what something is supposed to be in pretty specific or clear terms, then that's something that I think is much more approachable and accessible for citizens, and perhaps for commissioners too, in contemplating the merits of a potential land use change in the form of a zoning application, versus trying to digest. So this policy, this list of policies is kind of in the realm of the experts, right? In the realm of community leaders, citizen leaders, perhaps neighborhood leaders. But at some point, it's going to get lost in the minutia of cases outside of the experts, and so maybe there's a way to. That's just a response to your description of how you guys are thinking about that, or whatever that's worth.
And to that point, I think this list of policies, it's a comprehensive plan, so it covers a lot, and it covers a lot of things that this board will not necessarily need to refer to when looking at a rezoning. And so I think that emphasizes Commissioner Cease's point of oftentimes the most, I don't want to, weight things and say things are more important than the other, but one of the more relevant pieces of information that we often look to is like, what does this zoning designation or land use designation mean? And so having clear guidance around the place types, I agree, I think would be useful. Or even, I think even a list of relevant policies for certain place types would be a helpful way to organize this, so that at least we know, like, oh, these are how the policies we wrote relate to specific zoning designations.
You're kind of tagging on to both Commissioner Amendola and Commissioner Cease's. I also think it provides some guardrails for developers. If they know the place type area that they're working with as far as a rezoning, it could put some guardrails on as far as that it meets that. I know right now we do change the FLUM quite a bit whenever there's a new application that comes in. Sometimes if we are a little more deliberate in the way we define these place types, that could be something that could be helpful to developers to say, okay, this is what we've kind of designated. This is what the public is considering and planning department is working with. So it's part of that neighborhood engagement process that we know that we we want to see, more involvement with our community.
Just wanted to add this is a great discussion, and I think a lot of this is coming as folks have mentioned, because the current future land use map doesn't give a lot of information. In fact, it gives very little. Maybe you get a density out of it for the residential portion and just a very general description of maybe of allowable uses. So some of the intent behind switching to this sort of place type guide, place type model was to be able to provide more information and more specificity to have a better understanding of whether proposed applications are meeting with what the intent of the area is. So I don't have a conclusion, but it's just sort of bringing up to mind that this is hopefully some of the reasons why this shift in how the future land use map is being presented will be helpful for everybody involved.
I was going to make a saying at some point along the line, the reward for good work is more work. So I really think you guys have put a lot of work into it, and certainly the feedback that you're getting is obviously things that you can, go forward with. And so, if it wasn't that good of work, we would be probably not putting as much specificity to some of our comments here. So just wanted to give you the encouragement to keep going forward.
Yeah, and just to let you know, this is all helpful because you all are one of the #1 consumers of the comprehensive plan. We have similar discussions with our land use staff when we kind of review things with them. People who make the comprehensive plan think about it one way, but the people who actually have to look at it and apply it think about it another way. So I appreciate that, Commissioner Morgan, but no, we appreciate the feedback because you all will probably be opening it more than just about anyone else in Durham.
Yeah, one thing I was going to mention earlier is just having, because we deal with a lot of different kinds of cases, but like we deal with a lot of the really big cases. Like this body, more than anybody else, is looking at brand new neighborhoods that are going to be created in the future. And so having that consolidated so that it's just, this is the list. So that's what I was going to say earlier, but then I was also wondering, does that just belong in the place type descriptions? Because new neighborhoods are going to be within place types. So either or both, sort of all of the elements that go into the design and development of new neighborhoods could be consolidated, as well as ensuring that those are compatible with and specific. I think we would benefit from that, specific in how they're addressed in the place types. So that was just something that was on my mind as well. Because right now they're kind of all over the place. There's a lot of like overlap. I mean, obviously we're working. There was a lot of work that was done by a lot of different groups of people, so it's understandable. But making sure that as we move forward, that they're consolidated, and so that it's very clear and understandable, both between how the general policies work and then also how the place types work.
I'll just kind of chime in again. I'm hearing a lot that the sort of organizational framework of this information is really important, and how it can be filtered and looked at in different ways, and just kind of thinking out loud, but trying to think about ways. So we know there's important information that's in the policies. Some of that relates to place type. There's also the place type map and the place type guide. Obviously those will be in the plan together, but how do they talk to each other, and how are they shown next to each other, and how are they organized in a way so that it's easy to understand for a particular application type? These are the applicable policies, or for these place types, these are the applicable policies. Obviously, some of the policies we want to apply everywhere, and they don't have as much of a geographic component, but they are related to a use or a type of development, or a amenity consideration as part of a new development. So again, I don't really have a conclusion here, but just it seems to me that the way that this information is organized in the plan, and having different, perhaps even different ways of being able to kind of move it around or slice it up and look at it differently could be helpful. And, you know, maybe this is part of, obviously, our plans are somewhere there'll be a paper version of it, but they'll be online, and there may be ways to organize it in ways like that as well.
Yeah, I'm not a back-end web developer, so I can't speak to how to make this happen. But I know, like at my workplace, for example, we have a lot of internal resources, and we have a website that we can go to, and there's a drop-down menu that's like resources by category, resources by subject. I can't remember the specific criteria, but there are like 3 or 4 different criteria just alphabetically, and you can go, and they're just organized differently. So it can, sometimes it's a little bit messy, I'll admit, because it's like, which category version do I need to get there the quickest? But I could see like a drop down menu where one is like top 10 policies to know, and one is like policies by place type guide, or by place type, policies by chapter, whatever the subject is.
Yeah, I kind of even go back to the engaged goals that you have. I mean, if you organize the policies by the, because I see some of it already in the link to the goals and objectives, and aligning those policies with some of the subject areas that you've already defined. I know they're not exactly the same, but it would seem like if you could align the goals with the different policy groups, and then put the policies within that, that would be a good, easy access. And that could be a way for you to organize that information. That was kind of one of my thoughts initially. And I kind of said in my initial comments is you have some actual objectives that you're trying to accomplish anyway. And some of these policies that have been collected, you're validating what you probably put together initially. And some things you may find that are new that came from the public. So I think if you go through and align those and then place some of those policies in a list underneath those goals, I think that could actually make it easier to read and understand. And then I think there are some higher level things that, you know, just overarching type of things such as inclusiveness and diversity, and making, you know, it equitable for the public itself. So I do think there may be some higher level goals that kind of filters into each one of these individual subject areas. I'm kind of an organizer. I do like knowledge management type stuff, and that's kind of where I'm thinking.
I agree with Commissioner Morgan. I like the fact that you have these place types, and I think that ultimately, you know, some of these policies are already kind of naturally in those place types, but especially with the development that's coming in, or the rezonings that are coming in that don't necessarily align, and you have you know, the public engagement that has kind of told us what it is that we need to see, or what would work in that specific place type or area. I think aligning those policies very specifically would help. I think that the policies are great, but it is easy to kind of get lost in the sauce. And so I think it would be good to have very specific policies for specific place types. And I really like what Commissioner Morgan said about just the hierarching kind of, you know, these are the ideals that we would like to see, you know, across the board, and even implementing more when it comes to diversity or things of that nature in areas that just, you know, the nature of the beast or whatever has taken place, and we're just, you know, seeing that change that's not necessarily equitable.
This has been a really great discussion. I just want to note we have about 30 minutes left of our agenda for the night, so I want to make sure that we also get to hear from as many commissioners as possible, and make sure we make some space for folks who haven't gotten a chance to speak on this topic yet.
guess I had a real quick question. In the interest of time as well, if we have some written comments, who would be the person we would want to send it to? I don't want to necessarily send it to a whole group of, but who would actually be the receiver of our information?
I think if you could send, yeah, or Austin, did you want to go? Maybe.
Well, I was just going to say, if you send it to one person, they can all share it.
Yeah.
I definitely have been known to like send my comments to Lisa and then just be like, I don't know who else needs to see this, but like share it around. But Carl, let you speak more specifically.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. If either Scott Whiteman here, Lisa has also been a frequent contact and just dropped her email in the chat as well. So send it to one of us and we will definitely all receive it.
Just wanted to be sure that somebody would funnel them and filter it through.
Yeah, thanks, y'all. If y'all want to send things to me, this is Lisa. We are going to be organizing things as they come in. And so I think certainly if things get shared with any other member of staff, we'll make sure that it goes to everyone else. But if you want to just use me as a point person, that's great. Thanks.
And I will say staff is very kind and will read all of your long comments. So I really do encourage folks to provide written comments, particularly because that can provide more specific information than what we can get into in a short amount of time. But I do want to make sure that folks have time to ask questions now, particularly, yes, sometimes jokes are included in my comments as well. Yeah, other questions on these topics? I want to make space for everyone else. I'm going to kind of reserve mine for written comments to staff, but happy to engage in any more discussions.
I think one question is, I know maybe you all haven't carefully reviewed all 227 yet, but if there were things you were expecting to see that you didn't, that you think are missing, I think that's something we'd really like to know. That would help us know what we need to address in the future.
You know, one thing that Scott, in response to that question, you know, as Commissioner Morgan was describing organizing knowledge, and I was thinking about, and Carl was talking about, you know, kind of how all of this should fit together. You know, I look at each one of these, and I'd like to. Some of them, it's very clear the why. You know, and some of them it's very clear the means. You know, they have different focal points. One is how to go about doing something. One is this is a particular outcome. And maybe all of them need that filter to the point about adding additional work. But you know, what's the mechanism whereby this is to be achieved? You know, what's the cost implication? And so the specific item to your question of what's missing, Brian did this. I'm going to pick line 151, which is policy number, I guess it's the growth and infrastructure 17. A lot of these rightfully focus on costs, particularly making sure that costs for development and or things that cost are borne by developers and are associated with development. And it may be here because I haven't gone through all of them in fine detail, but the question of growth and growth management, I think, also needs to be informed by revenues, because in the Joe Minicozy world, you know, of understanding that the whole city operations, you know, there are not just physical impacts in the form of cost, which is what's identified in that policy item, but revenues should be considered as well. And I think that needs to be explicit because I think it's important for fully contextualizing the degree of transformation that we're seeing right now and are likely to continue to see, and the vast differences in development scenarios or different patterns of development. And so that's a particular line item where it could be included, but it could also perhaps filter through in other areas.
I got one quick thing. We have many square miles left to build in Durham. And I think to make, in whatever format as possible, make it as clear as possible and provide the clearest direction that we can through the policy, through the general policies and through the place type map. That from 1945 to 2022, we built our city for automobiles. And in 2022, we decided that that was a bad idea and that we were going to change and we were never going to build for automobiles ever again. And being very clear about that and understanding and making sure that when there are those 40-acre the 20-acre parcels, 40-acre parcels, these 80-acre parcels, that there's so much land and there's so much good that can be done with that land. And, you know, we can make sure that there's healthy foods for everyone who lives there and that there's daycare for people and that people can get to places and that there is an integration of jobs and a variety of housing types. And I just want there to be clarity that that our expectation is that we're going to create the most sustainable and equitable future city as we can, as is possible, in all new places where it's not infill development and we have to be more, you know, do more engagement with the people and when it comes to infill development. But when we're building outward, that in the clearest way possible, that we are making sure that we're building in the most sustainable and inclusive way. And when I look at the policies here, there's a lot of good stuff. It's all mixed up. I know that it was a lot of different groups and it's been consolidated. There's a lot of work that goes into this. And now I think we take this and provide that clarity that's needed, and incorporate that into the plan and into the place types. So I don't know how others feel about that, but I feel like that's just really, really important when it comes to how we think about land use and transportation and creating that division between the way things used to be and the way things are going to be, you know, from now on, and providing that clarity also to the development community. And I saw there was a policy about making the development process simpler too. And so there's that win-win opportunity, I think, for the community and also for, you know, making development easier. So that's on my mind.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add to that, that, you know, we're ultimately talking about growth, but we also want to preserve a number of things, hopefully the good ones, because in our history and in our culture, we have good and bad. And that intersects at sense of place. So public engagement is crucial to that. So I'm really curious, how do we capture and preserve not just the integrity, but the intention and, you know, all the effort that goes into public engagement and raising public awareness? How are the policies protected? We saw last month where in the UDO that some of the criminal penalties were removed, and that was kind of a heartbreak. So I'm just looking at it in a similar lens right now, as, you know, how do we preserve the progress and ensure that we're maintaining the right track for everybody in these policies?
I agree with Commissioner Baker's observation that we can make it as explicit as possible. Many of these dance around the issue of transportation, but ultimately, the aspiration of the comp plan seems to be, designing neighborhoods, not designing car sewers, designing places for people, not designing places for cars. And this is the opportunity to shift that, because that distinction between those two place types filters through probably 80% of this Excel spreadsheet in terms of line by line. I think it needs to be reinforced at every opportunity. And right now, as Commissioner Baker said, it's not yet explicit. I don't know how to make it explicit, but it's not there yet.
I think this goes back to something Commissioner Baker said, the clarification about that these are policies rather than action items, descriptions of things that need to be done. And that was partially because of just the volume of content that we were developing around the policies. But we went back to, there was an example Commissioner Cease brought up about line 151, providing a best estimate for the true impact on city and county services for new development, including water and sewer, transportation safety, greenhouse gas emissions, and school capacity. So just as a quick example, I know, and I was working with the environmental policy working group, the need and the appreciation for understanding what our greenhouse gas emissions are as a community and how to make them go down as quickly as possible, and understanding what the impact of new development proposals are on that scale, on that baseline that we have. This is a policy that I could see very directly having an action item related to, we need to develop a framework and a methodology and a calculation to be able to understand for new development, what is the carbon that is sequestered in the trees that are being cut down before the development happens? What is the carbon cost of the actual construction of the development itself? And then what is the carbon cost going to be of the expected trips to and from that development in the future? So that isn't to say that I think those action items will provide all of the answers or all of the guidance towards sort of continuing this vision that we're talking about. But I do think that very understandably, we read these policies and a lot of the times you kind of go, okay, that sounds good, but like, how are we going to do it exactly? And that how are we going to do it portion is definitely something that needs to be built into the plan, and that we're going to be building out through the action items and the implementation and the metrics that we're looking at with this. So just as a quick example, but I still definitely take to heart that we have things that we are hearing from the community, and we want those to be as razor focused and clear and non-negotiable to the extent that is possible through a legislative plan like this.
I'll just add on to what Carl was saying in this discussion, especially about action items. We heard a lot from each policy working group, specific things that were more actiony. And we also anticipate hearing from residents during this engagement period about other action items that come to mind when they're reading these policies. And so that's really an exciting opportunity to use that input as well, along with what we heard in the policy working group discussions, and see, are there really good action items that we need to have in this plan to help work us towards the policies and towards the community goals and objectives. So just wanted to say that that's one opportunity with this engagement. And then another thing that we didn't have a lot of time to fully develop in policy working groups was maybe this kind of middle between the goal and objective and the policy of a big idea, or maybe an overarching theme. Some groups discussed, that level that helped organize their policies under these umbrellas of a big idea that kind of helped nest ideas to get at. I think, Nate, you were talking about these kind of vision-y type things that were still specific. So that is also something we can think more about is in our organization, and how we can make those bigger themes and ideas clearer, because right now it's a lot of content listed all kind of on the same level. So just wanted to offer those thoughts.
I was just only going to say, when you're soliciting the public, they're not as much interested in maybe the distinction of a policy versus a tactic. And so you've got a mix of those type of information, although it's great, it's good feedback, and it validates some of the policies that you may want to implement. But then that's where the filtering comes in of, what is a real policy and what may be a tactic and what might go into the place type. So it sounds like that's kind of the next level or next challenge, I guess, for the group here, for staff, and then for us to review. So I do think that, like I said, it's, I think you guys have really captured a lot of information. Now it's how you sit through it.
Do other folks have questions and comments? Okay, seeing none, staff, did y'all have any other questions or follow-up for us?
Yeah, just have a little bit of closeout information, just kind of reiterate some of what we said. So again, the engagement phase for the reviewing for the entire community to review these policies is going to be going all through this month and through next month as well, so up to June 30th. So we'd really encourage you all to share this out as widely as possible. We're doing everything we can to make sure everybody that we know and can possibly think of is getting a chance to take a look at the policies and give us feedback. And of course, I think a number of you have mentioned we would really appreciate and would review very thoroughly any written comments that you all have, anything from high level stuff to there's a comma missing in this policy and everything in between. And we really appreciate the attention, the information. We know that it's been a long process to develop all of these. So just as a couple of closing things, as per usual, if you have feedback on how this retreat has gone specifically, we'd really love to hear that so we can keep improving these and thinking about how we can work together for our next retreat. Feel free to drop a suggestion in the chat or send us anything by email after this meeting. And related to our next retreat, so these were originally, when we envisioned these and started these up, these were intended as quarterly meetings. So we're thinking that our next meeting would be in August or September. And we definitely want to use some of that time to discuss revisions to the place type map. And we'll likely talk about the remaining pieces of the plan, some as well, maybe some of those implementation sort of action item things as well. So let us know if you all have ideas or things that would be good to discuss for that next retreat that'll be happening in August or September. That one will be likely the last retreat that we'll have during the actual development of the comprehensive plan before we anticipate that the adoption processes will be starting. Of course, there'll be plenty of opportunity for discussion during that adoption process, but this retreat will likely be the last one before that adoption process starts. So we can discuss at our next retreat whether some sort of continuation of these sort of sessions could be useful even after the adoption of the plan. I think we've appreciated having time when you all aren't buried under a lot of cases to be able to talk about things in the abstract and larger picture. Are there any announcements from anyone in the group, anything that anybody would like to share? Please just let us know, speak up, raise your hand, send something in the chat. We'll be happy to hear if there's anything that everybody should hear about.
I do want to provide a preview of our Tuesday meeting in a moment, but first, Carl, could you just remind us the expected timeline for when the approval process will start? My understanding is the goal is by the end of the year is when we'll be starting. Is there something more firm than that?
I don't, I think I'll defer that over to Scott. I'm not sure, or someone else on the rest of my team if we have an exact month in mind.
Yeah, I can, I can chime in. Just to back up in the timeline a bit, so we're aiming to, we want to release the full draft plan with all of its components for another community engagement round. Definitely not, we don't really have time to do as much in depth as we have in previous rounds, but before we start the adoption process, so around October timeframe. And then we're aiming for your December Planning Commission meeting to start the adoption process. And please, Lisa or Scott, let me know if I spoke out of turn, but that's our last discussion.
Yeah, this is Lisa. I was just going to mention, obviously the policies are a huge part of the plan, and we are anticipating getting a lot of input from folks about how we can revise them and make them better meet the needs of folks in our community. So we're sharing with you all our anticipated timeline, just knowing that in order to make sure that we're able to be responsive to our community and what we hear, that it's possible that that might have to shift, but at this point, that's what we're aiming for. So just wanted to give you all something to expect, but also want to make sure that we're building into our timeline that we really need to be responsive to what we hear from folks, and that may take a little bit of time. So just wanted to share that addition.
Thank you all for that. And staff, please correct me if I'm wrong in this assumption, but my guess is that this is going to be too much to discuss in one night, first off, and second off, if we continue our current rate of proposals, it definitely will be too much to cover with zoning. So just wanting to flag for folks to anticipate likely multiple meetings beginning in December to accommodate that approval process. The other thing I would just flag for our Tuesday meeting, there are 6 items on our agenda, which sounds really scary at first, but one of them, the Old Oxford Road, that's the commercial site in Bragtown that we saw a few months ago, that is going to be requested to be referred back to staff. My understanding is there's additional engagement with the Bragtown community that is going to occur with that site, and that will, just to make sure everybody understands, that'll reset the clock. When we saw it originally, that started our 90-day clock, but referring it back to staff will reset the clock, assuming we choose to do that. That is the anticipation. And then the second flag is the Triangle Veterinary Clinic. We mentioned this at our last meeting, but that's coming back to us. It had to come back because the notification process got a little messed up. So that should be a fairly quick case. So we will have 5 items to take action on, assuming that we do refer the Old Oxford Road back to staff. But one of them should be fairly quick. So hopefully that calms anyone's concerns about a super long meeting on Tuesday night, and we can be as efficient as possible. Anybody else have announcements or anything else before we wrap up? Okay. Staff, anything else from you?
Just a thank you. Thank you very much for being us with the space, taking additional meetings on top of the many meetings that I know you all do as well for this work. I think all of us know how important this is and what's at stake here. So we really appreciate it. A big thank you to everybody for coming tonight and having a good discussion.
Yeah, thanks again to all staff. Thanks to everyone who, both on this commission and anyone else who participated in the policy working groups. It's been a really incredible and important process. And it is not easy to add, for some of us, that's like a 3rd or 4th planning commission meeting in a month at times. So I recognize the extra commitment that is and appreciate you all and all the residents that participated in that. With that, I'm going to adjourn this meeting at 6:55. Bye all.
I just grabbed the last piece. Oh, can you hear me? Oh my gosh.
Yep.
Okay. I was muted and talking, and then I unmuted and it told me I was still muted, but I wasn't.
Gotcha. Yeah.
I just grabbing the last thing from the chat. So I think we're good.
Okay, cool. What's
Great.
this last? Great. We receive a brief summary.